And first of all, if you take the maps that you have, we'll be dealing with the very first one. And if you like to hold your map oriented, the top or north should be kind of up in that direction. Behind you would be where you can see Walker on the map. And I noticed when Frank got up to the bloody angle, he did specifically tell you about Walker and his Stonewall Brigade. They apparently extended down a little bit behind you. And then in front of you, that would be right behind the earthwork here, is where you can see the Brigade of Hoffman. You're right about in the middle of where this map shows Hoffman. You can see the dotted line that indicates a road that passes through the woods. That is just off in my right or to your left. And we're going to be going on a trail that kind of goes along that road eventually in this tour. You're also looking out into the McCool field, and I'll be mentioning to you at this stop an incident that occurred at the McCool house, and we'll be passing by that on our program today as well. Now, this program, as well as the next one, both kind of pick up where the program that we had early this morning left off. The afternoon program is going to continue with the Federal advance as it moved down the east face of the Muleshoe salient. And if you were to keep going straight for about a half to 3/4 of a mile, you would find yourself on the Confederate line on a portion of it that was facing the same direction that you are. But again, the troops that are around here, Walker behind you, Hoffman in front of you, they are facing this direction off to the west. So our program, if we titled it geographically like the other one for the east face of the Muleshoe, we would call this the west face. But we have a different name for the program because of the specific topic that we're dealing with rather than the location. This is our Lead to the Rear program, in which we're going to try to focus on Robert E. Lee and the units that he came in contact with. Now, as we look at the Lead to the Rear episodes, they are very interesting to look at and try to compare and contrast what is similar about them and what is different about them. One of my colleagues that used to work here that retired is Mac Wyckoff. I know many of you know Mac. He gave a program once in which he didn't call it Lead to the Rear, he called it Lead to the Front. Lead to the Rear we get from the soldiers, what they had to say when Lee appeared in and among their lines. They shouted Lead to the Rear, and Mac was not surprised that the soldiers are going to send Lee to the rear and call that out. What he found most interesting about these episodes is not that the soldiers sent Lee to the rear, but that Lee was found at the front. Why is Lee at the front? Is one of the things we may want to ask. We may not come up with exact answers. I'll share with you some comments at the end. But why is it that Robert E. Lee is attempting to lead some troops into combat? One of the things that our staff often has the privilege of doing is coming out on the battlefield with military groups. And always an interesting topic is discussing actions in which generals find themselves up at the front. When we are at Chancellorsville, a military group's discussing, should Jackson be in front of his troops on a reconnaissance? Is that the right place for a general to be? And there's not a consensus. Obviously, a high-ranking general might need to stay in the back so that he can maintain control of his troops, direct troops better from the rear. But there's something to be said about being up at the front, seeing things firsthand, having positive knowledge of what's up there, not what somebody else interprets to you. And often, sometimes, the leadership from the front is also important. Important for the troops to be able to see that what you're asking them to do is not something that you would shy away from yourself, but something that you would gladly do as well. Those are some of the things to consider as we look at an Army commander up in the front. Now, The lead of the rear episodes occurred over a 7-day time span. That's it. Never before, never after. The very first one occurred in the Widow Tapp field. Some of you went on the program, another early morning program that day, where Robert E. Lee led some Texans into action. A couple of characteristics that are important to take note about that one. First of all, what was the situation like at the moment that Lee went to the front? Now, earlier in that battle, Confederate line had been broken. But at the moment that Lee is leading troops in, he knows that he has reinforcements. He knows that a battle that the day before that had been fought with 2 divisions now will be fought with 5 divisions because of the arrival of 3 more divisions. There's a positive aspect of it, a confident aspect when Lee is riding forward with the Texans. One other thing that's very interesting about that is noting how very emotional Lee was. If there's any lead of the rear incident where Lee seemed to be caught up in the moment, the best candidate, in my opinion, not the saying that he was, but the best candidate is the Widow Tapp field. Lee was very excited when he learned the Texans had arrived on the field. He said, "Hurrah for Texas," just before it. And again, very excited in going into battle there. The next incident to occur of lead of the rear occurred on this battlefield, not very far from where we're going to talk about the ones that occurred 150 years ago today. It was on May 10th, following the attack of Emory Upton. There was at least 1 lead of the rear incident, possibly 2. We're not sure if the accounts that we have are talking about the exact same thing. One comes from the North Carolina Brigade of R.D. Johnston, who said the soldiers had to take hold of General Lee's horse and force him from the field of battle. The other account comes from Walter Taylor of Lee's staff. Taylor doesn't mention any particular command, but talks about Lee wanting to lead the troops in. And Lee on this occasion does a little bargaining with his staff. He says, "If you will promise to drive those people out, I will go back to safety." Now the other one before, the Texans just insisted that Lee go to the rear. This time, as Lee's offering to lead troops, he's saying, "If you guys make sure you do the job, then I'll go to safety." In the aftermath of Upton's attack, the earthworks that are right behind me were built. And as you can kind of see from your map, they do extend further up in that direction. They go just a little bit further in that direction. These earthworks, while right behind the mule shoe, do not follow the entire mule shoe around. Interestingly, they're immediately behind only the section where Emory Upton's men had broken through on May 10th. Later on that day, later on the day in which these earthworks were, well, they started to be built immediately on the night of the 10th, but the next day, the 11th, or 150 years ago yesterday, something occurred at the McCool house, again, which would be right in front of us in the middle of this little field. Robert E. Lee had gone inside the house, which, according to the chronicler, which is R.D. Johnston of the North Carolina Brigade, he said that Mule was using the McCool house as his headquarters at the moment. And outside the house on the porch were a gathering of other generals. Stephen Dodson Ramseur was there, Robert Rhodes, George Doles, and the Chief of Artillery, William Nelson Pendleton. And they said that when Lee came out of the house, he stopped and talked to them a little bit. The purpose of the discussion was about a courier that rode up and handed Lee a message. Lee read the message and then commented in what was said to be kind of a rather playful and light-hearted atmosphere. Lee said to these generals, "I do not know which one of you may be called to command the army when I am gone. Until then, you could not know the difficulties which beset the commander of an army, the greatest of which is to distinguish the true from the false reports which come from the scouts." And he shared with them a story of when he was in the Mexican War serving under General Wool. There was a report that the Mexican army was nearby, and Robert E. Lee was sent out to verify that report. He went out at night, reached the point where he could look over the Mexican camp, and realized that the report was absolutely true, but decided, even though he could see the white tents of the camp and he could see the guards immediately on the outskirts, he decided, I had better go a little bit closer to at least till I get to their, picket line. While he could see the men in the camp, he realized that there's some kind of a picket line further out, and he'd better report on that as well. So he kept going closer to this camp and going, never running into the picket line, and eventually realized that the white tents in front of him were sheep, and the sentinels holding rifles that he saw in the camp were shepherds holding their crooks. That's a little story that he shared 150 years ago yesterday right in front of you about the difficulty of determining exactly what the situation is around him. And that night he would have additional difficulties as he got word from his son of movements up in the direction of Fredericksburg of wagons, and then later at night would learn of the movement of federal troops getting ready to launch the attack that many of you just learned more about. Robert E. Lee is trying to weigh these things. And as you know, with the withdrawal, or for many of you know, if you've been on the earlier program, that the Confederates and Robert E. Lee, hoping to strike the Union Army while it is on the move, once it's pulled out of the earthworks, decided that he wanted to go after them on the march, and as a precaution to help his army move faster, he took the ones most reliant on roads on a day in which it started to rain and roads could get muddy and it would be more difficult to utilize roads, but the branch relying on that, the artillery, were pulled out. So now, that same evening, as there's concern about possibly something going on to the north of us, the men of John B. Gordon's division, that was the reserve, are going to be placed at some strategic places along the reserve line. Again, the troops that you saw on your map of Hoffman, they are put in position at about that time, sometime on the evening of the 11th, will be in the position in the earthworks right here. Nominally on the front line, on this western face is Rhodes's division, and as most of you know if you went on the earlier program, the north face and a little bit of the east face is Johnson's division. The 3rd division of the 3 that made up Ewell's Corps is John B. Gordon's, the reserve one, and again, those men are now dispersed on that particular morning. Now we'll pick up our story now 150 years ago this morning at what would have occurred somewhere along this line that you're looking at now. As Hoffman's brigade is here, the figure that we're going to be talking about is a colonel named Catlett Gibson. He's in charge of the 49th Virginia, again a part of this Virginia brigade under Hoffman right in front of us. He woke up that morning by a courier from General Gordon, waking him up and telling him in a very low voice that Edward Allegheny Johnson's division had been attacked, overrun, and captured. And when Catlett Gibson started to ask some questions about this orderly told him to be quiet, that Federals were nearby and might hear him. So kind of in a low voice, they continue talking. He says, I haven't heard any firing. How can this possibly be true? And the courier said, well, I heard the firing and so did General Lee. General Lee has sent me down here to give you orders to take your brigade off in the area of where the Confederate works have now been abandoned by Johnson's men. And Colonel Gibson explained, I'm not the senior officer here. You really need to deliver that message to Colonel Hoffman. He's senior here. And the orderly went on to say, I don't have time for politeness. I can't take the time to go find the right person. I've got to go notify another brigade. Now, interesting, somewhere about this same time, while we're learned that this command is supposed to get ready to march off to go to the area that was threatened, we also find that one of Ewell's staff officers, Sandy Pendleton, came here and told these men to stay put, to stay here in place. So there's obviously some conflicting orders that are going around here, but eventually a guide comes and takes these men away, and while they think they're supposed to go in the direction of where Johnson's division had been, they eventually find themselves going back further toward the rear, positioning themselves in the vicinity of Robert E. Lee's headquarters. And as we'll see at a later stop, we will pick up our story with these men of Gordon's command as they are sent not directly into action, but pulled further toward the rear, and we'll see the purpose of that later on. At our very next stop, we're going to turn things over to Eric. Well, he will talk a little bit more about what happens in this vicinity after Hoffman's men have now moved off and after some of the Federals start to approach in our area, moving up this west face of the Muleshoe.
First map, which shows the Federal attacks in the morning of May 12th. We are sitting in a salient, small little salient, a bulge in the Confederate Muleshoe in the earthworks that is referred to as Doles salient. On May 12th, as you can see on the map there, we are in a position that says Daniel. This is Daniel's brigade. North is off to your right, so if you want to orient your map in that fashion. This is an extremely important position along the western face of the Muleshoe salient. The topography here is very noticeable. In fact, from here, if we look north, looking up the face of the salient, you can tell from here, even though we're slightly over the backside of a hill, the ground does drop down into low ground if we were to travel up to the Bloody Angle, and then it rises as it hits the Bloody Angle itself. The construction of these earthworks occurred on the evening of May 8th, and quite possibly the reason for this salient here and the reason for the Bloody Angle salient was to be able to project the Confederate position out to be able to cover that low ground. So these rises, both at the Bloody Angle and down here at Doles salient, were extremely important, both as a defensible position as well as to be able to protect that low ground and cover that low ground between them. This had been the scene of tremendous fighting, as Greg mentioned. May 10th, 2 days earlier, Emory Upton, leading 12 regiments for the Union 6th Corps, had actually broken through right here at Doles salient. They had actually managed to breach the Confederate position. The attacks that occurred here in overrunning of Doles' Georgia regiments, his brigade, showed the weakness of this position, of the Muleshoe, that these tremendous earthworks the Confederates had constructed on the 8th continued through the 10th and on into the 12th. The Confederates felt that as long as they had artillery in this position, these were very, very strong works and would be difficult for the Federals to take. But on the 10th, on this western face, from where we are now, you can see perhaps beyond the line of cars, we have some artillery, some cannon stationed down there. The Confederate guns, from there almost up to the apex, the very tip of the angle, for the most part, fairly devoid of artillery. So on the 10th, when the Federals attack here, they realize that this is a vulnerable spot. Lee realizes that obviously after the attacks. Less than 2 hours after Upton had breached the line here on May 10th and been thrown back, Robert E. Lee sends a message to Richard Ewell. his corps commander responsible for the defense of the Mule Shoe salient. This dispatch sent at 8:45 p.m. May 10th, less than 2 hours after Upton had been thrown back and his attack repulsed. Lee wrote to Ewell saying, "It will be necessary for you to reestablish your whole line tonight. Set the officers to work to collect and refresh their men and have everything ready for the renewal of the conflict at daylight tomorrow. I wish General Rhodes to rectify his line and improve its defenses, especially that part which seems so easily overcome this afternoon. If no flanking arrangement, a ditch had better be dug on the outside and an abattis made in front. Perhaps General Grant will make a night attack, as it was a favorite amusement of his at Vicksburg. See that ammunition is provided and every man supplied." So immediately following the breach here on May 10th, Lee is instructing Ewell, and specifically Robert Rhodes' division, which is in this area, to take measures to reinforce and strengthen these defenses. Greg talked about the secondary line that he pointed out that ran behind us. You can see that on your map. The secondary line actually connects just to our south and beyond the two guns that represent Confederate artillery to our south. That secondary line runs perpendicular to the main face of the salient here, extends to the east, and then turns north. And if you look at that line, which is indicated by the jagged line on our maps, it runs behind Daniel, and on our map it runs, and then you can see Evans and Hoffman, as Greg mentioned, Hoffman's brigade back there along it. So that secondary line protects not only this position, but also provides a secondary position behind the Bloody Angle, what becomes known as the Bloody Angle. It also protects as a secondary position the low ground between the two hills, essentially, the one we're standing on now and the one at the Bloody Angle. So the Confederates did take the opportunity to strengthen this position. But where are they looking? Lee is looking. He's got strengthening going along the face here. Abattis, which were cut down tree limbs that were stacked out in front to create an obstacle. That's what he was referring to. Get more abattis out there to slow down the attacks. If we were to walk into the woods, as some of you did a couple days ago with our tour, there are additional entrenchments that are out in front, perhaps picket trenches that were dug for sort of an early warning system, men who would be stationed out in front of the main line to provide notification should the enemy be coming. But they're looking here. They're looking where the attack had occurred, where the Union attack had initially been successful on May 10th. And as we know, as you, I'm sure most of you were on the morning program, the attacks are coming off to the north on May 12th. And they're going to hit essentially the tip of the salient and down toward the Bloody Angle. So for Daniel's brigade, which are North Carolinians, they're defending this position. And as Greg mentioned at our last stop, the speed of the Union attacks on the morning of the 12th, the fact, as I'm sure you heard, the Confederate, for many of the men along the position up there in Edward Allegheny Johnson's division, their powder was wet. There was not much in the way of firing, not any sustained firefights for very long as the Union attacks came and rolled right over the earthworks. So for the Confederates down here, even though it's not that far from the point of contact where the Federal attacks occurred, the lack of any great noise, the darkness, there is fog as the sun is coming up, there is mist, all of this obscuring and subduing the fact that an attack is occurring up there. So for many of the Confederates in this area and from here south on Robert Rhodes' position, the first indication they will have is the Federals are already inside the earthworks off to the north. Daniel's brigade here is backed up by 3 regiments from John B. Gordon's brigade. Gordon has been elevated temporarily to command of Early's division, Jubal Early's division, and Clement Evans, colonel in the Gordon's Georgia brigade, is going to take over. 3 of his regiments, Georgians, are backing up Daniel's position here, and you can see them on the map. Daniel's response, once the Federals had broken the Confederate line and breached it off to the north. Cyrus Watson of the 45th North Carolina Infantry, here with Daniel's brigade, facing off to the west when the attacks come in from the north. He said, "We sprang to our guns at the first firing. They begin to hear firing once the Federals have entered the line and are trying to continue to push forward. Our brave brigade commander," this would be Junius Daniel, commanding the brigade, "our brave brigade commander came running up to the line from near the center of the brigade to our regiment and observed that the enemy on our immediate right was confused in gathering up prisoners." There is as much confusion in victory as there is in defeat, and as the Federals roll over, the Confederate lines get inside the earthworks, their structure begins to break down. Their linear formations begin to break down. They're dealing with prisoners, some slight resistance, and so after the attacks roll over, the Federal attacks begin to slow down. But the purpose of the focus of the attack is going to be then clearing that hole, moving down to the right, the Federal right, down to the south, pushing into the center, trying to open up and widen this breach. So the first intimation that Junius Daniel, Brigadier General commanding this, has is that there are Federals off to the north, and they're extremely apparently confused as they're gathering up the prisoners. Confused, the structure has broken down. In order to counter this, Daniel immediately takes action. He's going to take the 45th North Carolina, which would be off on his right, the farthest up the line, and he will bend it back, swing it around. It's called refusing his flank. He will bring it around so that the 45th North Carolina is now running perpendicular to the earthworks here, and they are facing north. They are facing the Federals off in the distance. Cyrus Watson of the 45th North Carolina said after they had swung around, he said, "We dropped upon our knees and opened fire upon the enemy, every man loading and firing as rapidly as possible." So they dropped to their knees. This is not something typically done by the soldiers on the firing line, is drop to their knees. Loading and firing is easier done standing up. But the reason for dropping to their knees is they're getting support, but the support is coming from behind. There are two Confederate batteries, artillery, just to their left, to the south. Those Confederate guns, in response to this attack off to the north, are going to pull their guns out, turn them around, and begin firing up the line, firing up into the bloody angle and into the breach of the Confederate position. Daniel's men, the 45th North Carolina, as they swung around, Daniel's going to push other regiments in to extend that line off to the east, facing north and facing the Federals. Daniel's men needed to get under the fire because the artillerists bringing the guns around, Daniel's men are right in front of them, and they're firing over their heads. Cyrus Watson said, "Immediately the artillery in our rear opened fire over our heads. For a little while, the rush of canister and shrapnel above us seemed dangerous. But the conflict was on, and in a short time, we became accustomed to it. The enemy in unbroken lines reaching back as far as we could see came sweeping on in our front. But this combined fire of infantry and artillery was more than human flesh could stand, and it was impossible for them to reach our lines." Daniel's quick thinking by swinging his regiments around had now created a roadblock. As the Federals had swept through Walker's Stonewall Brigade and they're pushing down to the south, Daniels has now created a stop. They can't get beyond him. They can't push through him and continue farther to the south. With this, the Confederates are responding. The Mule Shoe salient is inherently a poor position to defend. It has the disadvantages of converging fire coming on it. Once the enemy such as this gets in, they're now firing into the rear of the positions inside that upside down U, that salient. But a positive with the salient is if you're defending it, you have interior lines. You can pull reinforcements and quickly send them to the point of emergency. And that's exactly what's going to occur. Off to our south, you'll see there's a reserve line on your map. This is, as Greg mentioned, some of Gordon's men had constructed that line. It ran almost all the way across the salient. Below that, there are more brigades and troops, and they're being funneled in, and they're sent up into the salient. So the interior lines are going to play certainly to Lee's favor as is being able to send reinforcements to the point of contact. For Daniel's brigade here, Robert Rhodes immediately responds, the division commander. One of the important things about what happens here on May 12th, or one of the things that comes out, is you begin to see those men who are going to shine in the Army of Northern Virginia. Those men, Robert Rhodes, names that we'll be talking about, Ramseur, those men who are shining in this moment by rushing in and taking control. Rhodes immediately responded by sending 2 brigade, Ramseur's North Carolinians, Cullen Battle's Alabamians. Ewell's aide, Campbell Brown, had headed back looking for reinforcements, found Rhodes with Battle and Ramseur, and those 2 regiments, or brigades rather, are going to be sent in. You'll see them on your map. Ramseur's heading up into the McCool fields. We'll talk about him a little bit in a little more detail later on. Cullen Battle's going to move on up, and he's going to hit the southern end of Doles salient here and throw his weight in to trying to contain the Federals who are pushing toward the interior as well as down the west face here. As Battle came in, added his weight to this defense, he said his brigade was a solid wedge driven into the very heart of the enemy. In other words, he felt his brigade being sent in, added to Daniel's, they have now created a solid roadblock for the Federals trying to push down the western face of the salient. For Junius Daniel, here with his brigade, the man who immediately takes action and refuses his flank, gets his regiments out there and create that initial resistance to the Federals moving in and penetrating into the interior. Junius Daniel, at this point, 35-year-old West Point grad, had served in the regular army, was considered a very solid commander. He was shot through the abdomen that morning. Daniel was carried from the field and he died the following day. Another North Carolinian who would later move up to brigade command, Colonel, later Major General Brian Grimes, said of Daniel, he said, "He was decidedly the best general officer from our state. Though in all probability I gained a brigadier at his death, I would, for the sake of the country, always remain in the status quo, then the country should have lost his services." So Daniel's down in the early action as the Federals penetrated. And this is going to be sort of a theme, a very unfortunate one for the Confederates throughout that morning, is the loss of generals, high-ranking officers. As we know, as the Federals initially pushed in to the salient, the initial attack, the division commander, Edward Johnson, he's scooped up, as is George Stewart, a brigade commander, James A. Walker, the Stowell Brigade, wounded. Now Daniels is mortally wounded, and he would not be the last general to fall, Confederate general, to fall here in the fighting inside the Bloody Angle as the Confederates respond. The fighting at this point, an hour, maybe 2 hours into the fight, and the Confederates are rushing reinforcements in. From all over the battlefield, it seems, Confederate brigades are being pushed into the interior and into the Muleshoe. An hour, 2 hours into the action, it is by no means stabilized or contained for the Confederates. They have not stabilized, they have not necessarily contained the Federals, they're slowing them down. More reinforcements must be sent, more reinforcements are needed. And it's as those reinforcements come onto the field, as Greg mentioned earlier, that give rise to the lead to the rear episodes. So Daniel, Rhodes responding, his division commander, sending reinforcements, Ramseur up here, Cullen Battle's Alabamians, Daniel's brigade holding at this point here, keeping the Federals from moving down and clearing out the west face of the salient. But now Lee's going to supervise more brigades coming in. And if you'll follow us, Greg will take us on down to our next stop, where we'll take a look at Lee once again riding onto the battlefield.
We're off.
Using 2 different maps here, but if you'd like to start off with your first one, the top top of it should be generally off in that direction. That way is north. Most of you are facing predominantly to the east. And if you can find near the middle of the map a little block for McCool. The McCool house is further down in that direction, just beyond where you see the portable restrooms and the parking area. And we are back in the vicinity where you can see some troops labeled as Johnston. Johnston himself would be on this map behind some earthworks. And you can't see them real well from here, but if you look in that direction, you can see that there is a little berm that has some small vegetation growing on it. That is this reserve line, as labeled on the map, running right across the base of the Muleshoe salient. Okay. Also, off in that direction, here's the Harrison house and the Harrison field. I'll try to make a little reference to that a little bit later on and its significance in the day's fighting. All right, is everybody kind of oriented? Okay, good. What I'd like to do here is first off begin with tracing Robert E. Lee and what he has been doing on this day 150 years ago, leading up to when he's going to arrive in the very area where we're standing. Back at the Harrison house, off to the south of us, Lee would have had his headquarters established there, and he got up at around 3 o'clock or so in the morning, as had become his custom during this campaign. As he went to ride his lines, one of the first things that met him were some fugitives fleeing back from Edward Allegheny Johnson's division. And at this point, Robert E. Lee does not know what has happened yet on this morning. So as he meets these troops that are fleeing back, some of them panic-stricken, he took his hat off, and it's very interesting that we find many accounts that say Lee took his hat off. If ever he wanted to make sure that somebody knew who he was, he felt that by taking his hat off, he'd be more readily recognizable. Just sometime as you read about Robert E. Lee, note how many times it says he took his hat off. And he said, "Hold on, we're going to form a new line. Your comrades need your services. Stop, men." And it said that some of the men stopped, but that most of them were panic-stricken and kept on going past Robert E. Lee, something that he, of course, is not used to seeing. And he then yelled to the panic-stricken forces, "Shame on you, men! Shame on you! Go back to your regiments! Go back to your regiments!" Again, part of the reason why I think Robert E. Lee is shouting, "Shame on you," he does not know the reason why these troops have left. Now, I don't know if he would have said the same thing if he had awareness of it, but I do suggest to you that maybe this is a hint that he is not aware that some 20,000 men have overwhelmed the 6,000 men and just how difficult the situation was up ahead. He would soon learn, however. Riding back on an artillery horse was a staff officer of Edward Allegheny Johnson's command. His name is Robert W. Hunter. And when Hunter reached Lee, he said, "General, the line is broken at the angle in General Johnson's front." And it said that you could tell from the expression on Lee's face that his countenance had changed. He was very shocked and surprised, and now he knows from, again, somebody of authority that Johnson's men has been overwhelmed. Knowing that he had a reserve division back here under the command of John B. Gordon, Lee turns to Hunter and said, "Ride with me over to General Gordon's division." Now, the only troops that General Gordon had literally in reserve back here was Johnston's division, that's S-T rather than Johnson. Whenever we say Johnson, that's Edward Allegheny Johnson, the division commander up here. Johnston is Robert D. Johnston, the North Carolina Brigade commander, who is at the moment right behind those earthworks next to us. The rest of Gordon's division, as we touched on before, at my first stop, we were at Hoffman, Virginia Brigade, which was down there, and at your last stop, you heard about some of the Georgians of Gordon's old brigade. Those are the 3 brigades making up the division. They are all scattered, but Lee is riding back to this particular area, and Gordon has already acted. Gordon has gotten various nebulous reports that morning coming in, which he said none of them in and of themselves hinted of the disaster up front, but if you add them all together, he was fearful that something had gone terribly wrong. And eventually some bullets apparently even start flying out of the woods in this direction. Gordon took his one brigade that he had here, the North Carolinians under R.D. Johnston, apparently grasping that there was a massive federal force out in this direction that's working its way down the east face of the Muleshoe salient, that he needs a broad front to try to deal with it. He also knows that the brigade size is probably not going to be enough, but what's one of the atmospheric factors of this particular morning? Fog. And fog helps to do what? But obscure and camouflage. So Gordon thinks that if I put these men out in a solid skirmish line, they might be able to cover the whole front of Hancock's command breaking through. And because of the cover of the fog, if his men yell and fire enough, it might deceive the Federals into thinking it's a larger force and might bring them to a halt and buy him some time to bring back the rest of his troops, Evans and Pegram Hoffman's Virginia Brigade, to come back and get a more formidable body of men to go after the Federals. So that was his plan, and he sends R.D. Johnston into the woods. Johnston would end up being wounded in this particular action, taking a wound to the head that fortunately would not prove to be mortal for him. So, this is a situation when Robert E. Lee, with Hunter, arrives somewhere back in this vicinity. They run across General Gordon, and he explains to Robert E. Lee the dispositions that he has made in sending Johnson ahead and pulling back his other troops. His other troops are probably around here. If you'd like to switch to the next map, that is one that is labeled May 12th, 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. And if you find McCool House, we are to the south of that, or more toward the bottom of the map. You can see an arrow showing that Johnston leaving our vicinity, heading off to what is your front and a little bit to your left. And now let's deal with the other units of Gordon's command, Hoffman's Virginians and Evans's Georgians. They, at about this time now, have gathered up here, and you can see that the Virginians are to the left and the Georgians are to the right. This is a scene that Robert E. Lee would come upon, and now we'll pick up our story with the same man that I was quoting before, that Colonel Catlett, gosh, what is his last name? I forgot. His first name is Catlett. Gibson, thank you. Catlett Gibson of the 49th Virginia picks up by explaining what happens. He sees General Lee approach his command and rides up and salutes him, expecting Lee to give him orders, and Lee paid no attention to him, just rode right on by. He rode in a gap that was between the Virginia Brigade and the Georgia Brigade and rode on up to the front. Now, before I explain a little what happens next, a little background of something that happened to John B. Gordon as he was involved with sending Johnston's men into these woods in front of us. There was a point when bullets were flying by, and Gordon noticed that this one particular staff officer, his name was Thomas Jones, was kind of hunched over on his horse, while Gordon, always sitting erect, standing erect. It's often noted as one of the kind of posture and the air of confidence that General Gordon always kind of exuded. So Gordon is sitting upright on his horse, and a bullet flies behind him that he said actually clipped a little bit of his back. And the staff officer Jones says, "General Gordon, didn't that bullet hit you?" And he says, "No, but suppose my back had been in a bow like yours." He said, "Don't you see that bullet would have killed me?" He says, "Sit up or you'll be killed." So, Gordon is teasing or dressing down this one staff officer a little bit. And now let's get back to where I left off before, with General Lee riding on up to the front.
And everybody, again, in the Army had heard of the Lead of the Rear Texas episodes. I'm not sure if anybody had heard in the Army that Lee had an episode again or two on the evening of May 10th, as we discussed. But everybody has heard in the Army of the Lead of the Rear episode with the Texas Brigade and were aware of what was going on, including John B. Gordon. And Gordon will ride up to Traveler, will go, and it says he took a hold of the bridle at Traveler's right cheek. So, again, you're probably somewhat oriented the way this would have been, and I don't know if we're at the exact spot, but I think we're really close to it. So, again, imagine Lee going between these two brigades. Traveler's there, his right side of his head is here. So Gordon's on the other side, grabs a hold of the bridle, because he wants to utilize this as something to motivate his forces. And the man that I mentioned before, Colonel Gibson, says that while Gordon has grasped a hold, and we'll share with his words in a moment, but while he's talking to the men, that there is another staff officer on the other side who's grabbed a hold of the bridle and is tugging at it. He says it's almost comical that as Gordon is holding fast, there's a man on the other side tugging. And I often wondered, could this be Thomas Jones, the man that Gordon earlier in the day had criticized for not sitting up? Is he trying to maybe redeem himself in the eyes of General Gordon? We may never know, but I often found that interesting. We got two stories of staff officers, one dressed down and one obviously very anxious to be the one to take Robert E. Lee to the rear. So, while they're here, again, with Lee riding on up to the front, let me find my quote here. But the accounts that we have, one said of Robert E. Lee, not a word did he say, but simply took off his hat as he sat on his charger. I never saw a man look so noble or a spectacle so impressive. And one had to say the general's countenance showed that he had despaired and was ready to die rather than see the defeat of his army. Now, as we look at motivations of Robert E. Lee going to the front, as you might imagine, there are some that have indicated, as this last soldier, that this is an act of despair, that Robert E. Lee wants to pass, doesn't want to see his command defeated in this particular way. If you look at all the other kind of evidence around it, one of the reasons why I shared with you the story of the McCool house the night before and stressed the point that it was noted that Robert E. Lee was teasing the men as he's telling them this story from the Mexican War about seeing the sheep that he thought was tent. Lee is in a very good mood. He is also somebody that is very, very active. He had been up to this. He's active after that. He's putting in a lot of effort into this battle to try to make sure it succeeds. That is not the kind of person that I would think that wants to go into the action and have him go out in somehow an honorable way. I don't think, of all the different motivations that Robert E. Lee may have for these Lead of the Rear episodes, this is the one that I think has the weakest amount of evidence. But throw that out there, share it with you what one of the men here had to say. Gordon, again, is holding on to the bridle, and here is what he says to Robert E. Lee. I'll share with you basically two different accounts. You can look at the similarities and the differences. But he said, "You must not expose yourself. Your life is too valuable to the Army and to the Confederacy for you to risk it so wantonly." Gordon went on to say, "We are Georgians. We are Virginians. We need no such encouragement." And to that, our Colonel Gibson says the men all chanted, "No," as if, no, we don't need to have some kind of special encouragement. Gordon then said, according to Colonel Gibson, "There's not a soldier in the Confederate Army that would not gladly lay down his life to save you from harm." And he wrote, when Gordon paused after that, there was no response from the men. We're getting into something serious now. One to tell General Lee, no, we don't need him to motivate us and lead us into action, but we're talking about now the potential of every man potentially going down in this action. It is now getting serious. And then the comment from some of the men, come back, General Lee. We can't fight while you are in front. The men calling for General Lee again to go to the rear. Another account, to kind of start over a little bit with Lee already up at the front, said that General Gordon spotted Lee in front of the troops. And then it said General J.B. Gordon came dashing down the line. And at the sight of Lee, he reined up his handsome bay so sharply as to throw him on his haunches. It was a picture gosh, I can't read today. It was a picture never to be forgotten. And Gordon would call, General Lee, this is no place for you. Go back, General. We will drive them back. These men are Virginians, and they have never failed me. They will not fail me, will you, boys? And with that, the men started to shout, General, Lee to the rear! Lee to the rear! Go back, General. We can't charge until you go back. We will drive them back, General. And noted that at that moment, Gordon lets loose of the bridle and allows someone else to lead Lee back to the rear. So with that, now these two brigades, the Georgia Brigade and Virginia Brigade that are here, more organized force and more traditional battle line, will go forward ahead, as your map kind of shows in those general arrows, heading off to try to hit the Federals on the east face. The program this afternoon will cover the end of their action. Here's where they kicked off. You'll learn in the other program just what Federals they became engaged in and about their fighting subsequent to this. So now, with Gordon's men all being utilized in the woods in front of you, Lee now turns once again to Hunter, that man, the staff officer from General Johnson's division, who's mounted on his artillery horse, and asks him to help try to gather up units of Johnson's old command and to send them to General Gordon. I find that interesting. He feels that Gordon obviously has a grasp of the situation, has an idea of what can be done, and just like Eric mentioned about Robert Rhodes as somebody that seems to be a rising star on this day, that people take note of and see that he is performing very well. Lee is obviously impressed what Gordon has done on this morning, and once reinforcements gathered, he doesn't say go gather up forces and send them to General Ewell. He says send them to General Gordon. What about General Ewell? Perhaps it's at this time, as Lee continues to try to rally troops, or maybe it was earlier as part of his ride with Hunter, that he does find Ewell out here trying to rally folks. Ewell is cursing at his men, hitting them with his sword, telling them to run and hoping that the Yankees will catch up with them. Is that a way to rally troops? How many people do you think stopped when Richard Ewell swears at them and tries to hack them with a sword and hopes they get only hopes they get captured? General Lee will spot him and will ride up to him at one point and say, General Ewell, how do you expect to control your troops if you cannot first control yourself? And Ewell, if he was not on his way out as a Corps commander already by this point, this is the type of thing which Robert E. Lee, a man that's typically, again, very, very stoic, is somebody, it's a type of thing that he does not permit. And talking about his stoicism, to make comparisons with other Lead of the Rear episodes, everybody notes that Robert E. Lee was very quiet in this whole Lead of the Rear episode. He rode up to the front and basically stayed there until the men again sent him to the rear. This was a situation where what was ahead of him, he knew it was bad, he knew it was a disaster. He's not excited, again, very, very calm, and allowed the men to move on forward in their attack. There's going to be another Lead of the Rear episode, probably in this same vicinity, sometime in the aftermath of what we just just discussed, he will turn to, Robert E. Lee will turn to one of his staff members, Venable, and will send him on the far Confederate left end of the line requesting that Billy Mahone, a division commander, keep one brigade there on the left, but send the rest of his divisions, or rest of his brigades up in this direction. One that will arrive in this area that we will deal with this afternoon when we have a program called Confederate Footsteps is a Mississippi Brigade commanded by Nathaniel Harris. Because we'll be delving into it quite a bit later, I will just touch upon two aspects of the lead of the rear episode here. One is that Lee was in great danger under artillery fire back in this sector. A lot of the woods that are to your left front would not have been here, so perhaps these artillery might have even been able to see some Confederate brigades back here. I tend to doubt it, but it's tough to say with the vegetation as such. It's tough to stand on the Landrum Lane and know exactly what you could see if you looked across in this direction. But there are artillery projectiles landing in this area, and Traveler Lee's horse is getting excited. He's rearing up, and at one point when Lee, it looks like he might have had control, Traveler rears up one more time, just, they said, as an artillery projectile passed underneath the horse, right at the spot beneath the stirrups of where Robert E. Lee's legs would be as he's riding on the horse. So the inclination is, if Traveler had not reared up, that Lee would have certainly been killed by a projectile that would have struck him in the leg, thigh, hip kind of area. So it's that kind of scene that Harris's Mississippians arrive into, and as Lee offers to lead them in an attack, one of the soldiers, who is named Compton, was said to be standing by the head of Lee's horse. He grabbed the bridle rein and shouted, "General Lee, you are worth all of us put together. Can't you trust us?" "Yes," said the general, "I can trust you. Go, and may God go with you." Now, this is the last of the bona fide lead to the rear episodes, and it includes something that I find interesting. The soldier talking to Lee said, "Can't you trust us?" And I'm wondering, do the lead of the rear episodes stop because Lee might think, "Oh, when I appear in front of the troops, they're wondering if I don't think they'll do their duty without my leadership, that I don't otherwise trust them"? Maybe the reasons why lead of the rear episodes stop is because of that comment to him, and Lee making a conscious decision that it was being detrimental, is sending the message to his men that they would not do their duty, that he could not trust them otherwise. But that will be the last of the bona fide lead of the rear episodes. There is another one that we'll throw in. As I mentioned earlier, everybody in the Army has heard of the situation with the Texans. And there are some places where Lee appears on the battlefield, and the men see that he's in danger and will shout, asking him to go to the rear. And one such episode occurred in an area known as Heath Salient. One of our goals was to give a program there, and what we have to compromise that today we do have some folks at Heath Salient that will give impromptu tours as people show up. I hope that some of you, when you take your lunch break after this, may stop by Heath Salient. There's also a gap after our afternoon program where there's a bigger chunk when it would be closer to the real time of the attack down there as well. But one of our last tour stops as you leave, where there's fighting going on this day of May 12th, there's a man in Archer's brigade that talks about the Confederates receiving an attack by Union forces. These are from Ambrose Burnside's command, and Lieutenant Bird Wilmot that gives us his account said they yelled out, "Get ready, boys, there are 3 lines of coffee coming." Again, I think they're hoping to go out, as we've often found, to get clothing and food off of the Union soldiers after their attacks fail. So as this attack is going on, he said, "General Lee rode down our line from the left amid heavy artillery firing and stopped within 50 yards of our works. We all shuddered for his safety, and as one voice we cried, 'General Lee to the rear!' Unmindful of our clamors and fears and his element of danger, he held an animated consultation with some officers. General Lee pointed in a different direction and then with his right hand and arm made a sweeping motion. And this soldier went on to say that even though the men shouted lead of the rear, they don't really think that he was attempting to lead them. But again, just to show that story of the Texas Brigade had radiated throughout the entire Army. So, with this, Lee displaying an intense amount of leadership in this area, but in the long run, it is up to those soldiers and how they perform. And at our next stop, as we head on down, Eric will stop us near the McCool house and talk about some other brigades going into action on this day that will help to stabilize the situation up ahead of us in the vicinity of the Bloody Angle.